And welcome everyone to Dreadcutter podcast. My name is Ryan, the BachataRocstar male.
And I am Patty G, or Patty Jesus, avid Star Realms advocate.
Starballa on
Starballa
Starballa on the app.
on the app.
And we're just two dudes that really love Star Realms. And we're gonna talk strategy, we're gonna talk cards, pretty much everything that has to do with the game. Try to improve your game, try to make you a slightly better player if we can. We've been playing this game since its inception.
Yes,
And
it's deck one.
since deck one, since vanilla, physical vanilla. We were playing before there was an app.
I own every single card in the game that has ever been
Yeah,
created.
yeah. And I just passed 6,000 games on
Yeah,
the
he plays so much.
I'm currently a top 300 player. We just love the game, and we figured there was a bit of a podcast, video cast vacuum when it comes to this game. So we're gonna fill that void. Wanted to start off with a bang. So, like I said, we're going to answer the age-old question: Scouts versus Vipers. Pat, where do you stand on this?
I think for me, it's basically I have this whole thing where it's really you have to be mindful of your deck. You have to see what's out on the trade row. Obviously, like if you see a lot of like attack cards that are really small and like dinky like kind of damage, but they damage a lot, then I would go with the Viper because that will actually create more opportunities for you to hit an opponent a little faster and actually damage them and get them down to zero a lot quicker. Now, if you have a scout, right, it really depends. If I just need that one more trade, like there's a 5 or 6 cost out there that demands that I get a scout, then I'm going to be more inclined to scrap a Viper first, because I want to maximize the trade that I have. So it really depends on what the trade row has. More likely, I'm just more in favor of keeping scouts because I just know it. Sometimes it just takes that 4, 5, or 6 cost card to really like affect the game in a different way. So that is really my take on it initially. How about you, Ryan?
Wait, so what is it? Is it Scouts or is it Vipers? That's
Oh,
what people want to know.
for me, it's scouts are my favorite. So
Yeah, you're a Scouts guy.
I'm a
Okay.
scouts guy. Yeah.
So I agree with most of what Pat is saying. Ideally, you don't want to choose either one just sort of by rote. You want to go, okay, like what is the trade row offering me? If there are a lot of expensive cards, and I'm going to be my thinking is, okay, I'm going to win by getting a bunch of big cards, then obviously you want to keep scouts because then that will give you more access to the bigger cards. And you're not really trying to kill your opponent fast. What you're trying to do is build a deck that is really powerful and really efficient, and then you'll do almost no damage for several turns and then kill them in like boom boom 2 turns. Like that's sort of what you're thinking. But if you're building like an aggro deck, you're going to want to keep the Vipers because that extra damage is going to build up over time. 2 Vipers can do upwards of 6, 7, 8 damage, given enough cycles and given enough time, especially if your deck is really scrapped down. And so a lot of times too, you need that one extra damage to kill that base. You need that one extra damage to put your opponent down, instead of giving them one extra turn, excuse me, to come back and beat you. So I, on the other hand, am firmly on the side of keep your Vipers, scrap your Scouts. And the reason for that is because, one, I typically like to build aggro decks, but two is because there's far more Scouts in your deck than there are Vipers, and getting rid of your Scouts and getting rid of trade that very quickly ends up not helping you, I think is the best choice. So I'm very firmly on the side of Vipers, and it's pretty rare that I scrap a Viper in a game.
Yeah, I love the points that you made on that. I'm definitely about the bases that is so important. That's more of an intermediate thing, but it's just like sometimes you just need that one damage to get a base down, and sometimes the difference between the winning and losing can be that one base that you leave up. And if you can't take it down, then that person has more trade or more damage, and that ends up being the difference.
Yeah.
So we really have to pay attention. Now, here's another scenario where I scrap Vipers is if I get something that gives me a 3 trade or 4 trade card, then I'm automatically going to scrap scouts, because I already know I have prerequisites to trade. But if you see lots of 7 and 8 drops out there, and you want to get them all, then sometimes it's more helpful to scrap the Vipers. So it really is dependent on what you're getting when what the trade row is there for you. I think what would be important for us to mention is just the different factions, Ryan. So can we go over those real quick?
Absolutely.
And
Sure.
actually just give the pros and cons for each. And why don't you start with your favorite one?
I'm a Trade Federation guy, man. I
Yeah.
love them sexy blues.
Yeah.
Trade Federation is mostly trade, obviously. Uh, Mostly healing. They have some damage cards. Oh yeah. There also are a lot of cards that allow you to top deck cards, which means buy a card and then place it on top of your deck instead of in the discard pile. And that's sort of their role in Star Realms. How would you like to talk about your favorite color there?
Wait, one more, one more.
One more. Oh, command
Oh, I
ship.
don't. Oh, you can't see that.
While you're doing that, I'm gonna go find Peacekeeper because that's my other favorite.
That is probably my up there as one of my top 3 favorite cards of all time.
When we talk about our favorite cards, that one's definitely
That's gonna come up definitely. My favorite is I love the yellow Star. What is it? They're called Star Faction.
Empire.
Star Empire faction, right? And
The yellow is fine.
just call it the yellow. What are these names?
We don't even care what they
Red, blue, man.
the lore of Sorrow is not a big deal, right?
Yes, their proper name is Star Empire. Yeah. But what I love about the yellows is that I've always had this fascination with being able to discard someone 5 cards. And so this is the reason why it's my favorite faction, because discarding someone's card is great because you get the most insults from discarding somebody else when they could have gotten a dreadnought or a command ship or something like that. I just find
maximum
pleasure in
saltiness.
saying you needed just one more trade. Well, let me take it away. So that's why I love it, because if you get a really efficient deck and then have about 4 or 5 of these bad boys down there, not only are they hitting them for 4, 5, 6, 7 damage, they're also discarding, so it's a double negative for that opponent,
They can't not win anymore.
But it doesn't become a positive. That's the one. It's
not lose now.
It's positive for me, okay? It's a double negative for them, which translates to positive for me.
Double positive, double negative.
But just that's what I love is just the discards, the damage, the fact that it's also it's the most unweighted faction in the game, because they have all these draws, especially when you have Recycling Station, which is a ridiculous 4-cost card that in fact you even get to cycle your deck through a card. It's just pretty fantastic. And so that's really my favorite faction, just the trade. I mean, it's just so versatile, right? It has draw, it has damage, it has discard. It's just beautiful, So that's really the yellow deck for me.
So blobs are the green cards, the green faction, and they've got a bunch of powerhouses.
It's just great to say blob. I'm blobbing.
Blob is great, man. It's just, they sound exactly like what they do. We're just big old masses, and we just do damage and we smack people.
If you do damage, you put in the trade.
That's what blobs do. We find little circles with the red circles and put a number in it that's really big, and we shoot it at your face. That's what blobs do. Now, yes, there are blobs that have trade on them. Yes, there are blobs that draw, but it's not really about that. It's about the most efficient damage cards in the game. What you'll often find is that 2, 3, and 4 cost blobs are doing as much damage as 4, 5, and 6 cost cards of other factions. And they're the most efficient damage dealers. They typically combo the most. They typically have the most allied abilities on there too, and so acquiring a lot of blobs is a really great way to just win games. That was the very first strategy I ever came up with. I buy a bunch of blobs, I shoot them in the face, I'll win games. Okay, that's what I'll do.
We figured that out
Like,
fast.
yeah, like it takes a while to kind of figure out what scrap actually does and like why it's good. With blobs, it's just like, oh,
Bye.
shoot him, kill opponent, got it. And that's why blobs are awesome and are a staple in any good deck that is trying to actually kill somebody.
Absolutely, and also mentioned their control ability, right? Like they have their the ability to control the trade row, which is a lot of times the difference between also winning and losing is being able to see what your opponent can get and what you can't, what you can keep from them that you can't get. Yeah. All right, we have the last one, which is one of my favorite initial strategies was the red deck or the machine cult deck, right? And they were initially my favorite. Even before Star Empire, like they were my favorite like faction. Really, what Red Cult Machine Cult is about efficiency. It's about creating the most efficient deck, and through these cards, they also have a nice mix of damage and trade as well. A good mix of trade and damage. They're not going to be the most the most battle the most damage or the most trade, but they have a nice balance, and I think that's really what it's trying to get you to do is try to really balance out your deck really nice and create efficiency. They don't have a lot of draws or anything like that, but they really pride themselves on just creating the most efficient, getting rid of your scouts and vipers so that you can just blast your opponent for 30.
Red has some trade, not as much as the Trade Federation. Red has some damage, not as much as blobs or Star Empire. But they're the only ones that can scrap other cards, and that's what makes them really good. And so it's a lot of times what ends up happening is you have like a splash of red in your decks. You have 2 or 3 scrappers, and they're there just to scrap, and then your other cards fill in the gaps. Your other cards give you trade, healing,
Yeah.
damage.
So they complement other decks really, really well.
Yeah.
Like they can create more healing for you, they can create more trade for you. They just give you an opening for other strategies to come out. But the only problem, the only con about that deck is that it does take some time to fulfill its, original intention.
Yeah, yeah, because like once your deck is efficient, it's a powerhouse. But it does take a little while to get your deck to an efficient point. And a good aggro player can realize, oh, he's trying to scrap. I'm just going to aggro him
I'm gonna
because
blast them, yeah.
the 2 biggest problems with red is no healing and almost no card draw. And so, yes, your deck is becoming more efficient, but there still is that point where it hasn't become truly efficient and you're still drawing shit cards.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you're getting rid of them, but it's going to take a couple of turns, a couple of cycles through your deck to actually make it really efficient. Whereas if you just buy a bunch of blobs, like a lot of times you'll get killed before you can actually become efficient. Why don't you go ahead and do weaknesses for yellow?
The weaknesses for yellow is there are none. I'll almost get yellow. Not biased at all.
There's stuff. we're gonna pause the podcast here and then come back when we actually think of stuff.
I'm not biased at all that I have a dreadnought in the background. But it makes up for a lack of defense. Complete firepower. We are the Dallas Mavericks.
The Dirk Dallas Mavericks.
All offense. Our offense is our defense.
Our defense is our offense. Well, so here's the thing.
Yeah, but see, okay, yeah.
Seriously,
on a direct note, they have no healing. I mean, that's the big thing. Is that if you're gonna go a yellow deck, you gotta pretty make sure that you're gonna outdamage your opponent.
You better win now.
You better win now. or as soon as possible. As soon as you get yellows and you're in a yellow trail, you got to follow it. Otherwise, if you know, yellow has a very bad reputation of not synergizing well with other decks. You know, like it's just like when you have a yellow, you ever have like one of these cards in your deck and you're like, oh shit, like, and you have all blues or reds or whatever, and you have this card pop up, and you're like, fuck this card, like, you know, it's just because you have these cards that are just weighted. It doesn't typically combo well with other decks. It has to be on its own. So those are the two like weaknesses that I see for yellow deck. You know.
Yeah, you're kind of you're like in order to make a deck that has yellow in it work, you can't. It's not like red where you can just like splash a red. You know, you can't just splash a yellow. You're like, all right, we're going yellow.
If you're going to go yellow, you got to go yellow.
Yellow, you have to go yellow. You have to go hard.
Yeah.
You know,
the only other fact.
Like, oh, what are two yellow cards? Like, yeah, because a lot of times they work well with each other, but not really with other cards.
Yeah, I mean the only ones that would work well is probably with blob deck. Like that's the only like possible like combination, because then you can just go double aggro on that.
Yeah, yeah, you're getting a lot of redundancy there, which is
yeah, but by itself, like it's not a very good pairing with most decks. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the only like the only two possible weaknesses, if they are weaknesses. So.
if they're weaknesses.
All right, why don't you go with blue? What's the blue?
All righty, I'll talk about blue. So the pretty obvious one is not a lot of output in terms of damage. You know, there's a good amount of card draw, not a ton. You know, not as good as like yellow, but it's there. It's pretty good. You know, that definitely has the most trade out of any deck. You know, so that's sort of its strength, and healing. You know, so blues allow you to play a longer game. They allow you to extend the game farther. They typically have a lot of bases. They typically have a lot of outposts. It's a very defensive color. It's a very defensive faction. And so you end up playing a very defensive game. The problem with playing a defensive game is you're not furthering your strategy of shooting your opponent in the face. So what ends up happening is you have like 100 life, but your opponent still has 50. All they need to do is get a little bit of healing and a little bit of base, and now you don't have the firepower to get through them. And so then it's a stalemate that your opponent is eventually going to win, because his damage is better than yours. And that happens a lot in blue decks, where you have a ton of healing, you have a ton of trade, but you just don't have the firepower to win the game.
Yeah, and also that the fact that like most cards are also weighted too, just like reds. You know, besides the command ship, obviously, and and Peacekeeper and some of the other blues that we have, but they're not in itself a draw card. They are a ally draw card, which makes it a little tougher if they're not in a blue synergized deck. You know.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing.
Yeah, and like one of the things that makes something like the blobs really nice is they have a lot of cards that scrap themselves. So even though they're weighted when you actually draw them, if you just scrap them out of your deck, then they're gone. Whereas blue, a lot of their cards don't scrap themselves either. They just sit in your deck.
They sit and heal you.
Yeah. Heal! We're not dead!
We're not dead.
We're not winning either.
Can't move. Like,
I know, right?
we'll heal.
And so, you know, especially the vanilla 1-cost, 2-cost cards, you know, even as much as I love Cutter, like, it is a weighted card, and in the late portions of the game,
not as useful. Yeah,
it's nowhere near as useful. And a lot of times you kind of wish you had a card that dealt 6 damage instead of 4, or you know, a card that dealt damage every time instead of a card that just healed you a little more, because all healing really does is give you more time. But you need to use that time properly. You need to use that time to win the game. If you don't use the time that you get from healing to actually kill your opponent, the time doesn't really help you. So let's talk about blobs. And with blobs, I would say it's mostly just they're so aggro that it's the only thing that they do. They do one thing really well, and obviously killing your opponent is what you're trying to do. So it's not...
It is the base of the game.
Yeah,
they are at the core of the game.
The game is, you know,
the game is to kill your opponent
to win the game.
They're like Michael Jordan, okay? Like,
That is great. You play to win the damn game.
They don't care about other factions. They're just here
Yeah.
to win the
So,
game. Like,
I would say, and as a yellow player, you probably object to this, but I think just mono blob is probably the best like monocolored deck. Like if you're just gonna build only one color and you could only pick one color, I'd be like just blobs, go blobs, and shoot him in the face till he dies. Just my opinion. Don't get mad. Don't be mad.
my dreadnought, don't you see it here?
We're having a civilized discussion here, Pat.
My dreadnought will squash that
You
woodcutter.
don't see my background, motherfucker.
Don't you see all the scared blobs in the background?
Scared blobs.
They're running away. Okay.
Go like this. Put your hand on it. Show the people where the scared blobs are.
The scared blobs. They're all running away. This is my rebuttal. Yeah, but I would say, yeah, I mean, like, if I were to pick yellow and blue, like, if I was just an objective player, I would pick yellow. I would definitely pick blob.
Very good argument.
There's a reason why we say, "Oh, you're blobbing."
Yeah.
You know, there's no like your star empiring it. You don't say that. You know, when you're blobbing, that is red alert. You know, that is red. When somebody says they're blobbing, they have 3 or more blobs in their deck. You better watch out. You know, you better be prepared for that, because when somebody says they're blobbing, that is like, you know, red alert, all hands on deck. You know,
you're put on a clock. Okay, this guy has 3 blobs, then I'm probably gonna die soon.
Yeah. So what can I mitigate to?
It forces you to immediately like, all right, I gotta stop this somehow. And I think that is actually one of these sort of not underrated, but like it's a drawback for blobs that people don't think about. Because once somebody sees that you're going blobs, you kind of have to go blobs. Like you can't.
You're forced into their strategy, basically.
Yeah. And so then, now that they know what's going on, there's a very simple counter: bases, healing, and acquire just enough damage.
Just enough scrap. Yeah.
Right. Just enough scrap. And
you have to hold them out until you out efficient them, basically. You know.
Yeah. And the thing is, because blobs have no healing, they're also on a clock. Meaning, if they don't kill you first, eventually you're going to set up enough defense to where they can't really do anything.
Like, there's a lot of times, like, I would set up the perfect aggro deck. Be like yellows and blobs, and they're cycling, and it's great. And then the opponent is smart enough to get just enough damage, just enough little bits of healing and bases to hold off long enough to kill me. You know. So I've seen that happen a lot.
You get them down to like 4, 5, 6, or 7, and then they kill you on the next turn.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh, man.
It's like, I thought I had enough. And so there is a con to having a 100% aggro, you know. There's a con to that.
Like, the drawback is, if you don't win in the next 5 or 6 turns, like, you're not going to win. And that's the other big drawback for blobs is, unless it's a multi-faction card, they have no outposts. Blobs are entirely made up of only bases. Mm-hmm. And so your opponent can always deal damage to your face. And hence, you end up dying quicker. But basically, there's several like ways that you win the game. And trade is one of them. Like getting trade, getting damage, getting healing, getting bases. Like those sort of the big 4. Those are the 4 things you would think about in terms of how I'm going to win the game. A lot of times we overvalue trade. And so then what happens is we get 3, 4, 5 cards that have multiple amounts to trade on them.
Or trade, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but then that's all we have. So now we have no damage. And remember, the way you win a game is to kill your opponent. You have to convert your trade resource into your damage resource in order to actually kill somebody. And a lot of times what ends up happening is you spend the first 2 turns buying trade. Then you spend the next 2 turns buying the big cards. Then on the next 2 turns, you finally get those big cards. At that point, if your opponent just buys a cheap damage card on turn 1, a cheap damage card on turn 2, and then turn 3, turn 4, And then on turn 5 and 6, when you finally get your big cards, they've already used their cheap damage cards twice. And you're already
You're
at
already
half life total, or you're already at 30 life,
yeah.
and they're still sitting at 45.
Like basically you're playing catch up, you know. You're playing catch up a lot because they've already cycled all their damage. Now you have to take into mind this is more of an intermediate strategy. But are my buys for the 6, 7, and 8 drops going to be worth it over time? Can I catch up to that person cycling enough where those 7, 8 costs can outpower the 1 or 2 drop cards that you get at the beginning of the game? You know, and that's really always the gamble that you have to make.
Like if you saw an 8 drop on the initial trade roll, and you're like, okay,
I have to
I'm
get
gonna
that card. Yeah.
yeah, like immediately that's your first thought. Like, it's all right. I'm gonna do everything I can to get that card. And the problem is, though, if you ignore other cards that are, really good damage cards, especially like small 3, 4 cost blobs that are doing 5 damage and drawing a card, or 3 damage drawing a card, and you're sitting there with trade, 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 and then you're like, I finally got Capital World, yay! But you're at 20 health.
I'd actually rather take three, like one, three, 2 or 3 cost cards than take an 8 card cost card. So 3 efficient cards that combo with each other, then to take 1 8 drop. You know, just because when they cycle through the deck, like their powers combined are much more powerful than an 8 cost card sometimes. Yeah.
They're like Captain Planet.
Exactly. I favor synergy more than buying just any one 8 card.
Yeah, so that's sort of like the first beginner pitfall, is just overvaluing trade. So I think the second sort of pitfall that I see a lot of beginners get into would just be like straight up card evaluation. Like looking at a card and not sort of knowing which card is better versus the cards that are out there. Players either don't value scrap, which comes up a lot, or they don't realize how good certain cards are and why they should be going after it. Like the choices they make versus the cards that are available to them are often weird, and are often things that contribute to them not winning. Do
Yeah.
you want to elaborate on that, Pat?
Yeah, so I have some card examples. Like I have like the Blob Destroyer versus the Supply Bot, like both very good cards, you know. But like, which situation would you like these cards in, right? For example, if you're a person that is completely damaged and are just trying to aggro this person out, but you're like so focused on scrap and you take the scrap card, you know. Scrap, what actually it does is it actually weights down your deck for a while, you know, and it actually doesn't do anything besides like create more efficiency later in the game, you know. But if you're trying to like just blast your opponent, like Blob Destroyer would be great because like it not only has great damage, but when you synergize it, it destroys a card in the trade row and it destroys a base. Like that is way more, and more people will take, you know, will end up taking scrap because I need to scrap all the time and I want to be more efficient, you know. But there's certain circumstances where the Blob Destroyer will be just that much more effective, and it's a great card because who doesn't love a blob anyway, right? Sometimes you might want to take the Supply Bot, you know, instead of the Blob Destroyer. You know, if you're a person that is completely like has no scrap in their deck and your opponent is slowly gaining healing and different things, then you might want to take this away from him. Otherwise, that person will start scrapping so hard, and eventually, efficiency always wins out. You know, and so like there's certain portions where you might want to take this card just to keep it away from someone versus the Blob Destroyer.
So Pat, let me ask you. It's turn one.
Yeah.
I've got 4 trade. And those 2 cards, the Supply Bot and the Blob Destroyer, are available. And let's just say all the other cards are too expensive for whatever reason. So this is my only choice.
Okay.
This one or that one. What would you recommend
On a
and
first trade
why?
basis.
And then what should I be thinking beyond that turn?
So okay, I can take both of these cards, and I don't think that either one would be better than the other at
Mhm.
like first turn. You know, I think they're both great because they both serve a different purpose for a different deck. Now, honestly, like my selfish ways, like my selfish like very aggressive tendencies wants me to take Blob Destroyer all the time. Like
A
just because six damage is
lot.
a lot for any one
And
card.
it does cost 4, so
It costs us four.
it's a
So
better card.
so like it's a better card. No, but the thing is, the only so I would take this card if I knew I was going aggro completely. So I would have to find other blobs and other like damage cards to actually pair with it. And if I can't do that, it's going to be an inefficient card in my deck. I mean, it's going to be efficient because it's 6. It's always going to be great, but it's
Still
just
good damage,
it's
yeah.
still good damage. But I'm just saying I'm going to be thinking aggro deck. I'm going to be thinking more blobs, more yellows, more things that can draw, so that I can get to this card faster, so it cycles more. You know, because 6 times however many cycles of the deck, that adds up a lot over time.
So, in your opinion, the Blob Destroyer not only is a good first turn buy, but it's something that's going to be kind of a linchpin for your deck, and like
It
is
is
something you're going to try to get to over and over and over
it
again.
is a solid like engine card. It can be the centerpiece of your deck. You know, starting out.
Absolutely.
Like whereas this can also be a centerpiece for a great scrap deck, you know. And the reason I would buy this is if I saw 2 or 3 other scrappers on the board that I could buy also, you know. So if my rule is if you have 3 scrappers in your deck, you're like set. You're set for life, you know, because that's gonna create it really like really efficient in not in a very little time, the shortest amount of time, you know. And then also has trade, which is notoriously the weakness of a red deck. You know, is that they don't have trade at first. You know, a lot. So yeah, this is a great starter card for you to get if you want to create an efficient deck. But you have to kind of gauge your opponent on this because they can't have so much damage because it takes a lot of time for scrap decks to come together. You know.
Like a lot of people would have said, supply bot immediately, and over Blob Destroyer, no problem. And I'm with you on this. I'm like getting that amount of damage early and
Turn
trade
one.
row control and base destruction potentially all in one card is really, really powerful. The question is though, do I want to let my opponent have scrap? And that's the trade-off.
Yeah.
Where it's like, are they in a position to where they can buy this card? Is that going to help them? And is that card going to help them more than Blob Destroyer is going to help me? I think one of the things that would put me one way or the other would be, yeah, what else is out there on the trade row? Are there other scraps? Is there other opportunities for me to get scrap? If there is, it's not so important for me to get Supply Bot. If Supply Bot's the only scrap out there, maybe I just go for Supply Bot and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to be the only person with scrap. Or if there's like a lot of large cards out there, Supply Bot goes up in value because now not only am I scrapping, it's also making it easier for me to get to my other trade cards, which will allow me to get those bigger cards too. So I think if I saw a lot of small cards out on the trade row, like let's say the Blob Destroyer was actually the most expensive card.
For example, it had like this out with it, or even a trade bot, you know,
Yeah,
that.
yeah. If you see multiple
Combo
blobs
those,
out there,
like the small ones, like these are excellent compadres to the blob destroyer because they fill in some of the gaps that you know that that deck would have if it was just by itself. You know,
yeah.
this is
And the nice part
dangerous.
is too, with Battle Blob is now you start making a trade row controlling deck where
Yeah.
you're dealing a lot of damage, but you're also getting rid of all these big cards. So it's not really important that you have trade at that point because you're just going to get rid of all the high cost cards anyway, and
Hmm.
then you just snap up the cards that you need, and that's it. And then it makes then your opponent might say, "Oh, I'm trying to get big cards," and you're like, "No, you're not. I'm just getting rid of all of them." And that's a very viable strategy. It's a way to sort of damage your opponent, but also control them.
Yeah, I mean that's one of my most widely used like strategies that I employ all the time is like I love getting a whole bunch of like controllers and just like oops, you can't get that one and that one and that one.
And that's sort of the problem with trade and why I think it's overvalued the most and is sort of the biggest problem with it is that it is so trade row dependent, right? If just good big cards just don't come out, which happens a lot, you know, you're just kind of stuck with a bunch of trade and then you end up buying cards that really aren't that good. Whereas if you are just buying solid mid-level damage cards, a lot of times that's all you need to do.
Or one thing that I have like on that though is that if you have overtrade, then you have to have some other benefit to that. For example, if you have a blue deck that's completely blue trade, it actually has a good balance of a lot of things like damage and bases and things like that. And so if you get a ton of these like trade cards, like that's the only caveat that I have to that. You can have overvalue trade if you're also pairing it with damage or like healing or bases, and that can overwhelm an opponent too.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the other thing too. And this sort of pairs down to card evaluation. Do the cards that I'm buying do more than just one thing? Because what I have found is cards that have a narrow purpose are typically weaker than cards that have multiple purposes. For instance, my favorite 3-drop, at least in the vanilla set, is this bad boy right here, the Ram.
Watch Star Wars video one.
My God, is this card ridiculous?
Yeah.
5 damage, allies for 2 damage, and then scraps to give you 3 trade.
It's the most amazing
It's
thing.
the best fucking card. It's so good. It's so good. But here's why it's so good. One, 5 damage on a card is quite a bit. It kills all but the biggest bases. 2, if it allies, it gives you 7 damage, which then is enough to kill all the bases except for the 8,
Yeah.
8 bases. But and then if you see a mothership, if you see a dreadnought, if you see, some sort of really big 6, 7, 8-drop card, you can just get rid of this and pick that card up. So this card effectively upgrades itself.
Yes.
So it's not just pure damage, which wouldn't be terrible in and of itself. If this part on the card wasn't there, if it was just 5 damage, ally deal 2 damage, I'd still pick this card up almost all the time. Just the ability to potentially deal 7 is huge. But being able to then upgrade the card to get something else is ridiculous. Because the one problem with this card is it doesn't draw. It's weighted. It takes up a slot in your deck. But then when it scraps itself, a lot of times you're trading up to a card that does draw. So you're not only getting a better card, you're also making your deck more efficient. And that's why this card is amazing. However, if you take a look at another card, like, for instance, since we're sticking with vanilla, Embassy Yacht, this card also costs 3, but it's a blue card. Gives you 2 trade, gives you 3 heal. And then if you have 2 bases in play, it draws 2 cards. So it does a lot of stuff, but look at how much harder it is to set this up. You need 2 bases, difficult. You need to have them still in play, also very difficult. And then if you don't have that, this card doesn't cycle itself. This card doesn't scrap itself. It doesn't draw. It just gives you 2 trade, 3 heal. So I would argue that's not even worth 3 trade to begin with.
It's a perfect complementary card, it's not an engine. It's not going to drive your deck. You need at least 3 or more bases for it to even be viable. But you have to evaluate that and this is go back to card evaluation. You have to evaluate that when it looks on the trade roll. Yes, the text looks really nice and like the effects look really nice, but you have to really say, am I gonna even have a chance to use its effect? Maybe it's better for me just to get a cutter instead,
Cutter is a significantly better card than Embassy Yacht.
Yeah.
And it's cheaper.
Yeah. There's only certain situations when it's better, but it's very few and far between. Yeah.
Few and far between. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at another 3-cost card that I have a particular fondness for. Survey ship here. I really like this card because it gives you 1 trade and then it draws. So it effectively takes up no slots in your deck and allies yellow and gives you a trade and gives you a card draw. And this is the kind of card that's going to be good in the early game. It's going to be good in the late game. It's always worthwhile. And then it also can scrap itself to force your opponent to discard a card. So look at how much stuff this card does. It's very versatile. It's really good in pretty much all situations. If you just need a card draw, it gives it to you. If you need an allied yellow, it gives it to you. If you need to force your opponent to discard 1 more card to get them to that magical 5-card discard, it can do it. So it does a lot of stuff. just like, the RAM, for instance. It does a lot of stuff. And that's the thing that I think is most important when you think about card evaluation is, are my cards doing multiple things? Am I getting a lot of value out of it? If you're going to evaluate something, you need to get value out of it.
Yeah, and just to keeping on 3 cost yellow cards, like one of my favorites is Imperial Frigate or Frigigate, like I like to say.
Frigidity.
Frigidity.
that card deserves the gong sound effect. Absolutely.
I call it. Well, the first time I saw it, I was like Imperial Frigidaire, like
Vegetarian, right? Is that where they keep the soda?
the soda of whoop ass.
Like,
The can of whoop
that's
ass.
where we store the cans of whoop ass.
That's what I'm gonna call it now. It's the can of whoop ass. That's really what it is, because you drink it and then you can scrap it to draw, so it can be an unweighted card.
You crack it open to get another card.
Yeah, exactly. You drink it and you just throw it out, like. But this is also
explain to us why this card is so fucking amazing.
well, it's one of my favorites. It's like when there's nothing else out in the field that is like, worth it. More times than not, I'm just gonna grab this card, like, just because it has multiple effects. Not only does it has four damage, but you target opponent discards the card, which is one of my favorite features of the game. Is that you can
already you're getting 2 effects.
You're already getting 2 effects with one. And then when you ally, it becomes like a higher damage card. And the fact that you get to scrap it, just like the Rams effect, to draw a card, makes it, it's kind of like an emergency damage card. Like, you can just, it's like unweighted when you need it to be, It just basically is like, you drop your damage and go. But also in a yellow deck, it becomes a super amazing engine for a yellow deck, because that's why I love it, because it has so many effects and versatile. It can be a supplement to a deck, it can be a main engine for a deck. It just has so many effects, just like the Ram does.
Yeah, and what's great about the Frigate too is it's not beholden to just being in yellow decks. Yes, it's best if it's in a yellow deck, but the sheer fact that it deals 4 damage, makes your opponent discard a card, and then you can scrap it to draw a card. I mean, that's worth 3 in and of itself. If you just bought it, played it, scrapped it, and that's all you did with it, that's awesome. For 3 trade,
yeah,
that's awesome.
I would buy if it was a 4, like.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, sure. If it was a 4-cost card, I definitely would still buy it. Like, it's that good.
Like and that's really when we're going back to card evaluation, is we have to see what effects does it give me that is going to be worth the cost of trade, And so, like, that's when you're talking about, like, all these cards that we're mentioning, and there's many more that we can talk about. What am I getting value for the amount of trade? And the thing is, I have this theory that the person who uses their trade most efficiently wins. And so, like, if they have like they have a base of almost only like 4 or 5 trade that they can use every turn, and they use that the most efficiently, that's going to beat somebody that has 12 or 13 trade, but there's not using that efficiently, Like, even a person that has up to three trade per turn can beat a person that has like 8, 9, or 10 trade because of how efficiently they buy their cards. But obviously, that's something that they have to figure out as the game goes on,
Absolutely. Yeah. And, being able to maximize your trade and buy cards that are going to further a strategy that you have, figured out is really, really smart. It's really great. And I think that's the thing that the best players do is they manage their turns really well. They know, like, okay, on turn 1, I'm going to buy this, and then I think my opponent's going to buy this, so that will in turn allow me to get that. Or they're like, okay, I know on turn 1 I'm going to have 3 trade, so on turn 2, I'm going to have 5 trade, and then that will allow me to buy this.
Yeah.
And so setting up your turns and thinking about your thought process and already getting a plan for your deck and a feel for how this game is gonna go, really, really.
Yeah, and that's going to be like more as we talk about the intermediate and advanced strategies, like that is going to come up a lot. And so, like, stay tuned for that.
Guys, thank you so much for listening and watching the Dreadcutter podcast.
Thank you for scrapping your way through our podcast. We really appreciate you spending our time just chilling with our geekiness over here.
like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.